Welcome to episode 3 of Late to the Party, a series where I look at popular games from the past that I somehow missed out on. Today we're looking at a Capcom classic, so without further ado...
Let's rock!
The first, and until now only, Devil May Cry game I played was Devil May Cry 4. I bought it for the Xbox 360 on recommendation from a friend. I had seen one other friend playing the second game on PS2, and all I have is a 3-second clip in my head of one of the first levels. This is a game I've wanted to cover for a long time, so I was pretty eager to get into it. Before purchasing the game I took a quick look at the reviews on Steam, and these were somewhat mixed. The main complaint seemed to be that the PC port was just downright awful, but there were a few mods available to fix this. It took around 45 minutes to get everything working properly, and even then I couldn't get the Style Switcher mod to run, but nevertheless I pressed onward. The first cutscene brought me straight back to a comment I made about MGS3, in that the Japanese style of animation was a big turn-off for me. The chair flip and phone flip really annoyed me, and my investment in the game was already waning. But then when Dante engages in the first set of enemies, I found myself smiling at the ridiculousness of it all. I didn't know what it was until much later on, but there was something about this game that made this kind of animation acceptable to me, but we'll come back to that. The game has 20 missions to play through, and most of the missions have a boss at the end of them. Every single boss in this game has a rhythm that you must be in tune with to beat it. The first boss is the Hell Vanguard, which follows the gaming trope of becoming a regular enemy later on. I found this boss to be really challenging the first time I faced it, as I wasn't in the flow of the game. Once I started to recognise its moves, it became a pattern of shooting, dodging and hitting that was very enjoyable. Something I noticed from the outset of Mission 1 was the music. It fits the game perfectly, and even if it does get a little repetitive, it is very good throughout. The music actually gave me the drive to beat the first boss, and when it finally went down I had an immense feeling of satisfaction. This feeling carried over to most of the bosses, as each one has its own beat that you must play to, and when you hit it, it feels great. When I got to the second boss, I decided to switch over to easy, purely so I could get this video recorded on time. There may have been an element of frustration involved in the decision when this happened. After switching over, it took me less than 15 minutes to get back to where I was, and I was ready to continue on. Up to this point there had been quite a few cutscenes, but thankfully they're all around 90 seconds to 2 minutes long, meaning the gameplay isn't sacrificed to accommodate the story. One thing I need to say about the cutscenes is that the facial animation of all of the characters is great, and not just for a game that came out in 2005. The only thing I wasn't overly keen on with my switch to easy was that the difficulty drop was huge. With normal I did feel challenged, but in easy it was a little too easy. Once you understood the pattern of an enemy, there was no challenge to killing them. For this reason I will be doing a playthrough on normal, and possibly even higher difficulties at a later date. This game is very much a spectacle fighter. This was a term coined by Ben Yahtzee Crawshaw of Zero Punctuation, and the genre seems to have started with the original Devil May Cry. As far as I can tell, there was no other game before it that used the same system. God of War may have popularised the genre, but Devil May Cry was the OG, and that goes a long way to explaining why the combat in DMC3 was so refined. The entire game is based in and around a giant tower named Temmen Nigru, pretty sure that's how you pronounce it, and has Dante's brother Virgil trying to reopen the portal to the demon world so that he can take the power of their father Sparda for himself. Virgil has an assistant named Arkham helping him out, but little does he know Arkham is actually a demon named Jester also trying to seize Sparda's power for himself. Got all that? Good. You enter the tower after beating the boss Cerberus. This was a boss I couldn't quite get the hang of, but managed to beat with brute force. Once defeated, Cerberus recognises your power and gives his soul to you in the form of a set of nunchaku with 3 batons instead of 2. The cutscene after this is where I found the one exception to me liking the animation style. Dante's incessant use of the word woohoo. He says it quite a bit during the runtime of the game, but this scene takes the biscuit. I really liked the structure of Devil May Cry 3. Having each section split into 10 to 15 minute missions is perfect for my lifestyle, as I don't always have hours at a time to play games. I liked that I could just sit down for 10 minutes, bash out a level, and then go and do something else. There are of course a few missions which take a lot longer than that, and overall it took me just over 8 hours to complete. I was still satisfied with the amount of time, as I feel that Devil May Cry 3 has a huge amount of replayability. There are two things that need to be said about this game. Number one, the combat is incredible, and number two, the platforming sucks. Thankfully, there is a lot of combat and not a lot of platforming, because seriously, I cannot emphasize enough how difficult precision jumping is in this game. The next boss on the expansive list was the Gigapede, and while its name suggests a large man with a fondness for children, it was actually another trope of Japanese games. It reminded me somewhat of the second boss of Ninja Gaiden 2, and played in much the same way. The Gigapede is a giant worm-like creature that spawns from holes in the wall and must be defeated by constant damage to its body. The vulnerable spot on this monster was the head, but I didn't find this out until I had almost beaten it. After beating the Gigapede, there's an optional boss in the form of the Jester. This character crops up a few times during the story and is fightable 3 times. Each time gets progressively harder, but they are completely optional. I did finish all 3 fights, although the third one did give me quite a bit of trouble. Next, I had to power up some jump plates in the tower, as well as unlock a few more rooms to explore. This is where I got pretty lost, and it took me a while to find where I had to go next. This was one of the few occasions where I looked at a guide, as the place I needed to go was off camera, and the camera angle wouldn't reveal it. This is probably the only part of the game that I would have called out for bad design back in the day, but now I can see it was my fault for not exploring each room. Next on the hit list was one of the most interesting bosses in the game, Agni and Rudra. Having a boss fight with 2 enemies seems to be a popular way of ramping up the difficulty, as it is seen in a lot of games. Thankfully, for the most part, these always seem to be the most fun bosses to fight. Keeping your eye on more than one opponent is fairly tough in Devil May Cry 3, as the camera angle can be unforgiving if the two decide to separate. The tactic here is to keep both enemies ahead of you and try and make them hit each other more than they hit you. Once defeated, the pair become a set of swords that you can utilise, but as with most of the weapons in this game, they fell by the wayside to Rebellion and Ebony and Ivory. The game seemed to play much better with the default weapons, as they are the ones with which you spend the most time and thus become the most acquainted with. At the beginning of the next mission, we get another scene with Lady killing demons left, right and centre to show off her badassery. I wasn't really sold on Lady, because she took herself too seriously. I liked the ludicrous fight scenes with Dante because he saw it all as a game, but with Lady it was all brooding and stern. Going into the mission itself, there are 3 tests ahead of you. One is a simple memory puzzle where you have to go through particular doors to avoid combat and get to the end of the maze. Another is a room with a bunch of spears jutting from the wall and you have to get through the gaps. And the final one is an ordinary fight, except the enemies are invincible until you hit 2 switches to make them vulnerable. It was a nice break of pace to have to put some brains into the game rather than just fight your way through waves of enemies. There are very few puzzles in this game, and what little there is in the way of thinking puzzles are fairly easy to solve. There was a light puzzle later on in the game that I solved accidentally while trying to figure out how it worked. I think this may have been done intentionally, as the developers didn't want to keep people away from the combat for too long. During Mission 7, you have to run all the way back to the bottom of the tower to unlock a door that was previously blocked off to you. When making my way back, I saw a statue of an angel in chains that gave a little bit of info when inspected. It said, "I don't know what meaning it could hold," and I thought nothing of it until one of the final scenes in the game when you see it, along with all the others in the game, are actually giant bells that signal the opening of the demon portal. Next up, we have the first fight against Virgil. This is where Devil May Cry 3 really started to shine. At first I was getting my ass handed to me, until I started to identify the breaks in Virgil's attacks. There is a brief moment when you and Virgil clash, where a blue light is given off. At this point you need to dodge to avoid Virgil's next attack. Once I realised this, I managed to get into the rhythm of the fight, and once more I was able to beat the boss in a relatively timely manner. The fight against Virgil highlighted the fairness in gameplay for DMC3, whereas before I was ready to call bullshit on some of the moves that were being used against me. I saw through the spectacle and managed to see the fine art form that was the combat system. After the fight with Virgil, there was the Leviathan. The scene leading into this mission was excellent. I mean, I think it was probably the best scene in the game. At least until I was swallowed whole and had to fight my way out of the Leviathan's belly. The level itself was fairly well made, and it did harbour the first secret mission that I found. This secret mission was ridiculously hard, and I gave up fairly quickly. I will, however, go back to it at some point, as even after one playthrough, I am a way better devil hunter than I was a week ago. I started to experiment with the different styles here, and I was now using the Swordmaster style. This was the style I got on with best, and the one I went back to after trying most of them. I liked the ability to juggle enemies with swordplay, and trading a dodge for extra damage was a no-brainer for me. After moving through the belly of the beast, I came to the boss room, which was a little bit underwhelming. This came out of nowhere and was quite a weak fight. It was basically just a wave-based level with 3 squishy tendrils in the background that you needed to hit in order to kill the monster. The mission getting to the boss was fairly interesting, but overall I think this is the least engaging level in the game. After another long jaunt around the tower, there was the fight against Nevan. Nevan? A red-headed vampire lady who apparently also sings. While she was one of the more difficult bosses to get my head around, it was another case of learning the boss's tells and punishing them for their openings. My only qualm with this boss was her invulnerability when she had the bats around her. I understand that it is part of the fight to get rid of her shield before doing damage, but it was a little annoying to have to keep dealing with it. Her attacks were at least interesting, and fairly tough to dodge, which did make it a pretty good fight. Beowulf was another oddball thrown in out of nowhere. He was probably the easiest boss to fight, as he had barely any health and his attacks were really obvious. You don't even have to kill him, just get him down to a low level of health and Virgil finishes him off in a cutscene later. At this point I was using the gunslinger style, and at the end of Beowulf's fight you're given infinite devil trigger. This made the style extremely fluid and probably my favourite to look at. It was a little difficult to use effectively as I had gotten so used to Swordmaster, but it was nevertheless a great method of combat. After relieving yourself of the purple ball of power, you're treated to another fight against Jester. This one played out in the same way as the first, albeit with a few new tricks to deal with. Jester's damage output was a little higher this time around, and he was more evasive, but he still went down fairly quickly with a combo of gunfire and sword strikes. The next boss to face was Geryon, a giant horse with a carriage full of heavy artillery. This is the boss that gave me the most trouble, as I was never really able to pin down the pattern to beat him. I did eventually get through it, but it was one of the few bosses I needed to use Vital Stars on. This boss was a two-parter, with the first section being on a bridge and the second being in an arena. I quite liked both sections, but it was just brute force that got me through the fight. This is one of the bosses I would really like to try again on another playthrough to try and master. The reward for beating Geryon is the Quicksilver style, which allows you to slow time. A pretty neat ability, but the Devil Trigger trade-off wasn't really worth it in my opinion. The second fight with Virgil was more difficult, but actually seemed to flow a lot better. I'd really gotten into the flow of the game's combat, and fighting Virgil again highlighted this. I think this was due in part to the fact that I had switched to the Gunslinger style, which seemed to be much better for building combos than that of the Swordmaster or Trickster. The cutscene following this fight is the longest in the game, and sheds light on a lot of the mysteries from the story so far. It's confirmed that Jester and Arkham are one and the same, and Mary, or Lady, is the daughter of Arkham. Arkham sacrificed his wife to gain demonic power. He wanted the power of Sparda, but the power he got was that of the Jester. It still made him immensely powerful, but it wasn't exactly what he wanted. The next mission was a bit of a runaround, as I had no idea what I was doing. You have to rotate the tower to get to different parts and collect pieces of a power source so that you can use an elevator to get to the top of the tower. Even saying it is a bit of a mouthful, and playing it out was no walk in the park either. It took in excess of 25 minutes to get through this section, and it wasn't particularly satisfying when I did. I just felt like I'd been on a really long fetch quest, which wasn't what I had come to expect of the game thus far. On my way to the next mission, I found another secret mission. This one was just a rehash of a puzzle I had done before, so it took less than a minute to finish. The real puzzle in this level was gaining the Onyx Moon Fragment. In this puzzle there are two giant balls. These are objects that you've seen before, and you basically just have to hit them until they explode. These ones, however, need to be smashed together in order to break, and I ended up looking for a guide to get past this. At the end of the mission we have the boss fight against Lady. This was fairly easy, as she has barely any HP and her DPS is extremely low. The only difficult point really is hitting her. She is really good at dodging your moves and has quite a few counters that you need to be wary of. As I said though, this fight is a bit of a face roll, and I doubt anyone has ever really struggled with it. After the fight, Dante has a bit of a moment of realisation, with Lady inspiring him to do the right thing. This doesn't seem out of character, as Dante's moment doesn't last long and is well written. I like that the writers managed to make a character that is edgy, funny, over the top, and emotional all in one without sacrificing one trait for another. Remember earlier when I said that the platforming in this game sucks? Well, this is where it really started to affect me. There is a room that is literally just one long platforming section, and I struggled so much with it. I honestly thought this game was going to get away with minimal platforming, but no, there was an entire section dedicated to it. After getting through that room by the skin of my teeth, it was time for the final Jester fight. This time there was one major difference. Once Jester gets to a certain amount of HP, he gets a giant smiling ball to walk around on. This makes it a bit of a pain to hit him, but I had switched back to the Swordmaster style, which made it a little easier. The next fight on the list is against the Doppelganger. It took me a minute or two to figure out the strategy, but once I had it, the fight was pretty simple. When you open all of the lights and expose the shadow, he takes huge damage from all of your weapons, so goes down pretty quickly. Beating the Doppelganger gives you the style of the same name. I never actually tried this one out, so can't say how useful it was, although I have heard it adds a rudimentary multiplayer mode, meaning if another player has a controller, they can control your shadow. That's a pretty rad feature if you ask me. Moving through the demon world was fairly artistic, in that everything was quite surreal, and it had a reference to that famous piece of art that I'm pretty sure is called Crazy Stairs. During this mission, however, you have to fight a number of the bosses you have already faced, again, and I felt that this was pretty lazy. After beating a few of them, I realised you didn't actually have to fight all of them. If I had known this from the beginning, I would have fought the easiest ones, or the minimum amount required to unlock the next section. The bosses I fought were the Gigapede, Agni and Rudra, Nivan, Beowulf, Leviathan, and Geryon. The only one that gave me real trouble here was Nivan, as all of her attacks were masked by the new lighting in the demon world. I had to predict her attacks based on the movements and sounds she made, rather than just seeing the attacks and dodging them. It was fairly interesting, but not interesting enough to outweigh the laziness of redoing old bosses. Next up was a series of fights back through the demon world, the only one of note being the mirror room. In this room you had to ignore the demons and focus on the green mirror which moved throughout the different frames. It was tough to couple avoidance with hitting an object you can't lock onto, but it was engaging nonetheless. Next was what I thought was going to be the final boss. It took me a long time to get to him as I got completely lost on the way to the room. The fight itself took me a couple of attempts, and it was one of only 2 instances where I used a yellow orb to redo the fight and not have to start the mission from the beginning. Having Virgil come in to help you towards the end was a nice moment, and being able to semi-control him was fairly useful. This is another section where a second player can help you by controlling Virgil as well. I read up about this after completing the game, and the wiki said that Virgil has a lesser number of combos but is invincible for player 2, so that's nice. The only downside to having Virgil there is that any moves assigned to the B button were disabled along with the devil trigger, meaning the most powerful moves in my arsenal were off limits. Once beaten, it was time for the actual final boss. The final boss of the game is Virgil. He's trying to take Sparda's power and Dante is trying to stop him. Virgil sports all of the same moves he's had all along, with a few new ones to boot. He also has a much more powerful devil trigger, which makes him invulnerable and extremely hard to avoid. This fight was the absolute pinnacle of the game, and really plays into the strengths and weaknesses of the combat system. The ending scene sees Virgil refuse to be saved by Dante, as he says he wants to stay in the demon world. Dante sheds a tear for Virgil, and Lady notices, but Dante shrugs it off. I think the ending was directed well, and shows great characterization for Dante as well as Lady. Everything gets wrapped up in a neat little bow, and while the credits roll, you're left to slay as many demons as possible. I managed 134 in case you were wondering. There is a final cutscene showing Dante opening his shop, Devil May Cry, and Virgil in Hell running to engage the Prince of Darkness. This was a good ending to the game, and the fact that you unlock so many features upon completion really speaks volumes for the amount of content it has to offer you. Finishing Devil May Cry 3 really made me want to play the first 2, and I would definitely be picking them up at some point in future. It also made me want to replay this one though. The game is always driving you to be better, pushing you to get those combos going, and get through the missions as fast as possible. All of the characters in DMC3 are interesting and engage with me on a personal level. I found Dante's arrogance to be enticing, as I knew there was some pain behind his words. He shrugs everything off as a game because he doesn't want to accept the responsibility left to him by Sparda. Virgil is very similar to Dante, but he wants to embrace his demonic power and do what Sparda wouldn't. He wants to rule over humanity. Lady is a femme fatale covered in mystery until you see her break down in front of her father, revealing a lost and scared little girl. DMC3 manages to deliver a serious story without taking itself seriously, and this is why it is an exception to the rule of my dislike for Japanese-style animation. It plays its character flaws very well, and doesn't make them one-dimensional. Even if there are only 4 main characters in the game, it feels like a larger story is at play. Throughout the video, I've been describing my experiences with the bosses, and with the exception of the demon world where you have to replay a few of them, they are all unique and interesting. My favourite though has to be the first fight with Virgil, as this is where the game showcased its fair approach to combat. Even if I complain at a later date about it being too hard on the upper levels of difficulty, I'll know that at its core it is perfectly fair. Devil May Cry 3 is widely regarded as the best in the series, and I can see why. There is a perfect blend of long and short-ranged combat that is incredibly inviting. It's one of those skills that's easy to learn but difficult to master. Even with this in mind, the game always feels like it wants you to be better. It subtly encourages you to push on if you're having difficulty through its use of atmosphere and music. When you get to the Time God statues, the music changes to a heavenly choir, giving you a moment of respite amidst the chaos of the rest of the game. Dante himself is arrogant and cocky. He knows that he can beat just about any enemy he faces, and by the end of the game, so do you. Devil May Cry 3 is definitely deserving of its title as one of the greats. Its combat system, coupled with its storytelling and characterization, blends perfectly to make an incredible experience that needs to be felt by everyone. If you're going to play a Devil May Cry game, make it Dante's Awakening, because it might well awaken something within you. For the first time since starting this channel, I have become obsessed with the game I'm reviewing. I stated earlier that it took me around 8 hours to finish Devil May Cry 3, but I continued playing long after those 8 hours. I've finished the game 2 more times and am slowly making my way through the difficulty levels. I've managed to fully level all 4 core styles and maxed out all of my weapons. I can't get enough of this game. I complained about having to replay the old bosses, but it actually worked in my favour. I repeated that mission 8 times in order to level all of the styles, and now I have most of the bosses down to muscle memory. I quickly gathered some footage after initially completing the editing for this video, because I want to show what 20 hours can do. Those hours spent playing have changed me from this into this. Every combo flows effortlessly, and I've even started incorporating other weapons into my fighting, meaning I have far more versatility now than on any other playthrough. If 20 hours can improve me this much, I can't wait to see what the next 100 will do.